Hello and welcome. My name is Humphrey Hawksley, and this is the Goldster magazine show, the first of a weekly Goldster conversation with fascinating, compelling guests from whom we will learn, we will be inspired, and then we will quiz and hold to account to make sure that they're on the level. My guest today is a person of passion and causes close to his heart. His career has been on the front line of trauma, campaigning against cruelty and any abuse that violates people's lives. He straddles those worlds of struggle, both personal and political. He's worked for the BBC and the United Nations. We'll hear about that. We'll also ask and hear about what he learned from Stephen Fry when he talked to him about mental health and a feeling of hopelessness, and what caused him to break down in tears on global television in front of an audience of millions. Each of us is affected in a personal way from either witnessing or working with or seeing constant headlines packed with bad news. How do we navigate the storms within and around us? Welcome, Chris Guinness, to Goldster magazine show.
It's great to be on your inaugural show, losing my Goldster virginity along with you, Humphrey. So thank you very, very much indeed. And it's nice to be here with your audience too.
Can I use that, Goldster virginity? We'll put that in some sort of a thing.
Losing your Goldster virginity, you may indeed.
I love your glasses. Did you get a fashion designer to do them or something?
No. They're from a chain. Some of my friends say I look like Coco the Clown. Others say I sound like Coco the Clown. That is perhaps for your audience to judge. But yeah, they're maybe a bit over-designed. Who knows? Overstated perhaps, but I love them.
Oh, well, that operates me. So this is the Goldster magazine show. Like Goldster Conversations, put anything you want in the chat and we will address it during that. And then we have the Q&A at the end. So the first question I've got to ask for the audience is, does Chris Guinness look and sound like Coco the Clown or not? And we'll see what happens. Now you've worked at very senior levels, UN and the BBC, and you're highly knowledgeable about trouble spots, Gaza, the Middle East, Myanmar, and Southeast Asia. But I want to start with your origins. Many people meeting you think of you as posh and privileged, but that is the case, or is it not?
It's certainly not, according to my origins. My mother is a working class girl from Basingstoke. She's now 95. And on my father's side, my grandfather was an indentured labourer, which is another word for saying slave, sold by one British owner in India to another landowner. He was put on a ship, this is my grandfather, and transported from India to Trinidad in the West Indies at the end of the 19th century. After the emancipation of indentured labourers, my grandfather became a teacher. He started a school and he educated my father. He'd worked in the sugar plantations effectively as a slave. My father was a bright boy. He won an island scholarship. In those days, there were 2 scholarships offered to the 2 brightest boys on each of the Caribbean islands, in Trinidad at least. And my dad won one of those, came to the UK to study, and met my working class mum. My father, because he had an Indian mother, of course, had to be a doctor. All Indian mothers want their sons to be doctors, especially their eldest son. And so, he was a great linguist, but he ended up studying medicine, married my mum, went back to Trinidad, where he worked for government, for the health service in Trinidad. And that's where I was born. In the dying days of the British colony, I was born in 1959, and Trinidad became independent in 1962. So I still remember, in my early childhood, the kind of the violence or the social upheaval that happens at the end of empire. And then my parents split up. I came to England and lived with my working class grandparents in a council house in Basingstoke. I'd hardly call that posh and privileged.
How old were you then, Chris, when you moved?
I was 6 when my parents split up. We came to England. And then my father arrived one day and said, my children will not go to state schools, government schools. And I was sent off to a posh boarding school, which was basically an Oxford scholarship machine. And I duly won a scholarship to Oxford.
Was that Eton or Harrow or one of those?
No. It was called
Ardingly.
It was called Ardingly. It was a minor public school in Sussex, which I was happy there. I made wonderful lifelong friends. But really, to send a kid from the Caribbean, where there were sort of white sandy beaches and sunshine and swimming pools, to a Victorian boarding school without central heating, where you had cold showers, was really quite a jump. So I then went to Oxford. Sorry.
So you were born as a colonial subject, in fact, and then,
Yep.
then you came here. You've got a British passport, have you now? Or
I do, and a Trinidad passport.
You've dual. And when you went to this minor public school, did they know where Trinidad was? Did they know that you were not one of them?
Not really. I mean, Ardingly was, so it's called Ardingly in East Sussex. It's a wonderful school in many ways. But no, it was a very, it was of its time, really. So my father was, was a dark Indian. And because I seem to inherit many of my mother's genes in terms of my appearance, I could pass as a white kid. And I had a sort of semi-posh accent, though actually I was born with a Trinidad accent. My mum, she was the first member of her family to go to university and get a university education. And she didn't have a working class accent, particularly. She had a pretty nondescript accent, a bit, I guess, like mine. But then, Oxford, I was a choral scholar at New College, which was a very posh college, which was full of people from Eton and from Harrow and from Winchester, really not just public schools, but very, top-notch public schools. So Ardingly, to answer your question, was, it was quite white and quite middle class, wasn't particularly international, but I blended in to the background like I think kids of that age do. And then Oxford was really very posh, and it was if you did the liberal arts at Oxford, it was assumed you wanted to get into the fast lane and be a BBC trainee, which I did. So basically I had very, origins, which I would say were in slavery and British working class. But by dint of my education, you might be forgiven for thinking I'm a posh boy, but let me tell you.
I think I can forgive myself. I think you're borderline posh privileged.
Yes. And yes. I think poshness is in the mind. I mean, I'd like to think that I don't have the attitude of white privilege. And I wonder whether your audience can identify with. I think that, often.
What is the attitude of white privilege?
Well, I mean, the cliched version would be that you tend to look after your own, that you might be quite small-minded, that you perhaps tend to be further to the right than to the left. I mean, a lot of, I think, probably misconceptions. Interested in money, interested in housing, nice home, nice car, all that kind of thing. I don't own a car. I've never owned a car. Actually, I own my mother's car, which I wrote off after about 6 months.
But just what did you study at Oxford?
I studied philosophy and theology.
Okay, and you always wanted to go. You mentioned the arts just there. You always wanted to do something like that, as opposed to be a doctor, like your father wanted you to be.
Yeah. So my father introduced me to literature and to philosophy from a very early age, actually. And so I wanted to either read English literature or something, or philosophy. And in the end, I ended up reading philosophy, which was great because it wasn't something I was taught at school. So everything was completely new. And I did find Oxford very sort of intellectually thrilling because there was so much to discover and to do. So I didn't just study. I went on the Edinburgh Fringe. I did the Edinburgh Fringe with Ian Hislop, no doubt, who has remained a dear friend of mine. Imogen Stubbs also, she went to the RSC. She married Trevor Nunn. She was very famous. Paul Twivy, he's now a writer. So I dabbled in the arts as well as, studied hard.
And was there anything to do with your origins there, or were you just thrown into with a heap of Oxford undergraduates that came from all over the place?
Well, most of the Oxford graduates I dealt with and I was close to were actually white and pretty privileged. And I think since then, Oxford has made a big effort not to be white and privileged. But, I look back at what some of my contemporaries did, and they went on to become academics who teach promising white kids. And that's not my idea of what an education does and what the arts are for. For me, education and the arts are about social transformation. So I love classical music, for example. I go to a lot of classical music concerts. I'm engaged. But for me, classical music and the arts should be about social transformation and about building societies in a sense of community. I love, for example, St. Martin in the Fields in London, in Trafalgar Square, which essentially is a sort of homelessness charity with a brilliant head of music, a guy, full disclosure, a friend of mine called Paul Keane, and he's a brilliant programmer of music. But you go there They do, you can hear an hour of Bach. As my stepson actually just did a concert there, brilliant concert of Bach. But you pay an extra £10 and you get a sort of fish and chip lunch in this amazing crypt. And there's a real sense of community. And I think at its best, the arts and academia really are creating a sense of community, either intellectual community or some kind of social interest community. And unless it does that, I'm not that interested. So, you go to somewhere like Wigmore Hall, and it's often full of white privileged people and white privileged performers performing in silence to white privileged people. That's not my idea of music. For me, music has to be about... Sorry.
No. I'm fascinated. I wanted sort of, we're based back in the Caribbean, where you are the grandchild of a slave, essentially, and a working class mother and all the rest of it. Your mention of white privilege is sort of flowing through the conversation. I know that I prompted it a little bit, but and you go to a minor public school, Oxford, and then you become fast-tracked as a BBC trainee. When you got to the BBC, what did you find different or the same as Oxford and the public school?
Well, my spiritual home in the BBC was Bush House,
which
was the home of the World Service.
Yep.
Sadly, it is no more. They moved out of Bush House. And there at the time, we had 44 what they called language services. So as well as broadcasting the World Service, which many of your audience might be familiar with, especially those who've lived abroad, we also broadcast in 44 languages. There was they called it the Eastern Service. It was all very colonial, east of what, brackets, London. So there was the Eastern Service, which was any language between Burma in the East, as it was then called, and Afghanistan in the West. So Pashto, Urdu, Hindi, Bengali, Burmese. And then there were the Far Eastern Service, again, very neo-colonial title, which was, Thai and Vietnamese and Bahasa Indonesia, Chinese service, Mandarin and Cantonese. There was a Japanese service for a bit, but that got axed. I mean, the World Service has always been cut. I mean, the British government sort of has been very stupid and slow to realize that one of the best exports it has is the BBC, both in English and the language services. So yes, so for me, the BBC was about a kind of Tower of Babel. The Bush House canteen, you'd walk in and there'd be, French and Spanish, but Japanese and Mandarin and Russian and Bulgarian and, Swahili. And it was extraordinary. And I loved that. For me, it felt, when I arrived in Bush House, it felt like I was coming home, because my background had been a very international one. I mean, Trinidad was colonized by so many different nations. There's a big Chinese community, there's an African slave community, an Indo-Caribbean slave community, but Portuguese, Spanish, French, Syrian, you name it, they're all there. And so for me, coming to Bush House was really like rediscovering my spiritual home and the values. I mean, as you probably remember yourself, Humphrey, the World Service was a cross between an aid organization and a broadcaster. Yes. So, as a trainee, I'd write a sort of editorial about the sort of Bangladeshi paddy industry. It was that sort of, you'd never, ever be able to do it now. But it really did have this sense of global transformation. This was before the days of globalization. And I think many people in the World Service felt that they had the same values as an aid organization to try and make the world a better place. Yes. And they're really, naive as it may sound, I think a lot of us who went to the World Service in those days did it genuinely because we had an agenda, a very agenda with a small a, which was to promote human rights, perhaps to promote democracy, to promote prosperity, to promote dignity, to promote development.
Do you still have that agenda?
Oh, very definitely. I mean, that I think has informed everything I've done, not quite in my life, but certainly, after, in the BBC, I wasn't interested when globalization came. There were huge interest in the captains of industry, rich people living, rich lives. I wasn't interested in that. For me, news was about oppressed people in hot countries. Okay. And it remains that, to be honest. I'm not that interested. I mean, I'm interested in the movers and shakers in that they influence how oppressed people in hot countries live, but I'm only interested in them to that extent. I think rich people are actually often quite dull, and although they seem very powerful, I think the real power with people lies at the grassroots, and that's
that's where the great literature comes from the Caribbean and elsewhere. But I want to say you're going through these sort of institutions in the way of elite
All
Christian.
very elitist, by the way.
Yes, I
you
was going to
think about it,
say, yes.
I went to a prep school, I
Yeah.
went to a public school,
Yeah.
I went to Oxford, I went to the BBC, and I ended up in the UN.
Yes. So you're a man that works in it, but I want to say is that you have two elements about you which we call diversity now. You are colored, technically, although I can't see it, and you are gay. So how do you manage those elements in modern Britain and then again in the international world where you live?
I mean, I'm lucky enough to live in a social milieu where I don't even have to think about managing them, because I live in a set of people who are liberal and who have certain values, and therefore being non-white and being not straight are just not an issue. However, I am painfully aware that for an awful lot of people in a lot of the parts of the world where I've worked, it is an issue. I have various rules, even when I work in the Middle East, for example, where there's a huge amount of homophobia, there's issues around homosexuality and religion. I never lie. And that's a touchstone. So I may not always tell the truth. So, if I find myself, in a mosque in Gaza, I don't come out. On the other hand, if someone there were to ask me if I were gay, I'd say yes. I'm not prepared to lie. And the thing about lying is that it's corrosive, right? If you tell one lie, then you generally often have to tell another lie to cover that lie. It's just so much simpler to tell the truth. And although I didn't come out to a relatively late age, that's because I think I have the right to try and like everyone, to sort of explore themselves and to discover what they really are. But I mean, basically, I don't lie. I hope I'm right in saying that.
So you didn't come out because you were afraid to come out. You didn't come out because you weren't quite sure.
Yeah, I mean, I just, life was going on, and there was perhaps a need occasionally to tell people. It wasn't a massive issue, really. It was with one or two of my friends, but nothing insurmountable. And it's never been either being gay or being Anglo-Indian. It's really never been an issue in my life, though. I've seen the issue of homophobia and racism affect so many others. So of course I'm very aware of it.
When we talked a little earlier, you said that you used a word that I hadn't heard a lot, where you pass on. So what does that mean exactly?
Well, there's a very good book by a friend of mine who was at the BBC called Lipika Pelham, called Passing. And passing is where you find yourself, as I did, for example, at Ardingly, in a group of people. I thought, maybe they're a bit racist. So I don't particularly want to tell them that my father was as dark as my shirt. I can pass as a Brit. I've got a poshish accent. I look a little bit English. So I won't tell them. And that's called passing. And the same is true of being gay. I don't think I'm immediately sort of obviously gay. Maybe I am, I don't know. But I don't feel the need, to sort of explain it. So sort of backing off your identity, that's known as passing. I think at Ardingly, I certainly passed in terms of my colour, my race. And that's because there were tinges of racism. It was a public school in the late 1960s in Middle England. Yeah. That sort of, there was some racism without a doubt.
It's a bit like tucking your heart into your sleeve as opposed to wearing it on your sleeve.
Yeah, exactly.
And you decide when. We have a question from Denise, which we won't answer at the moment, but I want to float it with you and the audience, because I want to talk to you about this. How do you manage your own mental health with the situations you have encountered? This is basically what we're going to be talking about on your work in Gaza and in Myanmar. But right now, you did an interview with Stephen Fry, which will get us into this. Tell us what you took away from that interview and what sort of person he was.
It was a very interesting story because Stephen was due to give a talk at the Barbican, the big arts institution in London. And it was for I think the 250th, I probably got that wrong, birth or death of Beethoven, who was classically bipolar. And he wrote a famous letter to his brother called the Heiligenstadt Testament, which was almost like a suicide note because Beethoven was going deaf and had real problems. And his doctor sent him to this place called Heiligenstadt. And Stephen was meant to read it. And he double booked and didn't turn up. And as a sort of quid pro quo, he said, I'll give you an interview, I'll read it. And so the head of music at the Barbican said, well, why doesn't Chris Guinness go and record it? And Stephen said he'd ask a few questions. So I turned up at this sort of commercial studio in a basement in Soho in London, and Stephen read it utterly beautifully. And then I sort of was in the studio with him, and he said, well, I said I'd chat, so let's chat. Sort of 2 hours later, Stephen and I were still chatting, and they'd recorded everything. And so we turned it basically into a series of 4 podcasts. I mean, Steve was extraordinary because, I mean, he's one of the smartest people around, because I think part of his sort of bipolar thing is when he's sort of, you know, in his sort of manic stage, his brain works 1,000 miles an hour. He's incredibly creative. He's also an amazingly generous human being. So he will just give you every thought in his head free of charge. And I think, you know, his work in terms of human rights, in fighting homophobia, he's made films about it, I think is extraordinary. He's the most amazingly giving person. I mean, what I really love about Stephen Fry is that not only is he achieved so much, he's just so generous. He just gives it all away for nothing, basically. You know, and I really admire I admire his honesty. I think, you know, he doesn't.
You talked
lie.
to him about suicide, didn't you? And this hopeless feeling, which I think probably affects all of us in some stage.
Yes. I mean, I mean, Stephen's learned to manage it, I think, absolutely brilliantly. But I mean, there's a famous occasion when he was in a play that was badly reviewed, and he just absconded and kind of fled. And there were other occasions when he sort of came to London with his father's credit card and went completely manic and crazy. But he writes about it with incredible honesty. I mean, I think that's the real hallmark of Stephen Fry, that, you know, you think however low he might ever have sunk, because he's got that essential self-knowledge and that honesty, which I think are 2 ingredients for dealing with any mental health issues. I think you have to begin with an admission to yourself that there are these issues that need to be addressed, and to be honest, not just with yourself, but to those around you. And I think that Stephen Fry has that in spades, which is incredibly important. That coupled with a generosity of spirit, all he seems to want to do is to give to other people. And I think those 3 things really define his greatness.
I think the giving, we've had a lot of discussion on these shows about how generosity actually has a feel-good factor about it. It releases some chemical in the brain that makes us all feel good. I want to move on now. There are 2 areas of, you've been a BBC correspondent, you worked with the UN everywhere. There are 2 areas I want to focus on. One is Gaza and one is Myanmar, as Burma. You you broke through in your BBC career covering Burma back in 1988, didn't you?
Yes, it was quite an interesting story. I mean, it was the summer in Bush House, aforementioned Bush House, and all the big name correspondents were away with their families on holiday. And we began to get sort of rumbles of revolution in what was then Burma, became Myanmar later. And my editor, a man called Nick Nugent, said, listen, get yourself a visa. In those days, you could only get a tourist visa. If you applied as a journalist, they wouldn't let you in. It was like a secretive North Korean style state. So I went to the Burmese embassy in London, got myself a visa. And the night I first went to Bangladesh, which promptly flooded, you know, 3/4 of Bangladesh was underwater in 1988. I then flew to Myanmar. The night after I got there, Ne Win, the general who'd been in charge of Burma since 1962, got up on telly. He said he was going to resign. He would usher in, there would be a period of multi-party politics, a pluralist economy, you know, everything was suddenly going to change. And the revolution sort of started. I was a cub reporter. I was working underground. I was, you know, going to record material and then go out the country and process it. And what happened was some students found out that I was in the Strand Hotel in Myanmar, which was this sort of rat-infested pit. It's now a sort of 5-star hotel, like Raffles in Singapore. In fact, you know, it's the same sort of chain, I think. I was then, the students left a note under my pillow saying, be outside the hotel at 9 the next morning. I was taken away. I was bundled off in a car. I interviewed students about, you know, basic questions like, you know, how strong are you? How worried about your military repression? And I did the interview in English, so 4 or 5 questions, and then I repeated it in Burmese. I don't speak Burmese to this day. I don't speak Burmese, but they replied in Burmese because the BBC had a Burmese service, and they had 2 broadcasts a day. And one of the students had the foresight to say in Burmese, our revolution is going to start at 8 minutes past 8 on the 8th of the 8th of 1988. And I didn't even know that was said because I don't speak Burmese. And the tapes were then smuggled out in diplomatic bags, courtesy HMG. And they was from the Foreign Office, they went over to Bush House, and they were broadcast on the 6th of August, 2 days before the 8th of the 8th. And in Burmese, this went out. And in those days, all 44 million people, the population of Burma, basically listened to the Burmese service. So suddenly, a whole nation knew when the revolution was going to begin at the exact moment, the exact minute. I didn't know, I had no idea. So, and I was then kicked out of the country. I was then in Bangladesh, reporting on Myanmar, phoning up people and trying to get sources and corroborate information and all that kind of stuff. And suddenly at 8 minutes past 8 on the 8th of the 8th of 1988, the dock workers in Yangon, in Rangoon port, down their tools, came out on strike, led the entire workforce of the city with them. And, you know, the revolution had begun. So I had effectively, as a cub reporter, fired the starting gun on a revolution without even knowing it.
Which is still going on, which is unresolved. So
yes, I mean, yes. Sadly, yeah. I mean, and what happened is on the 21st of September that year, there was a brutal massacre outside the main city hall in Yangon, in Rangoon, and you know, the military took over. Aung San Suu Kyi, who'd come back as, you know, she actually come back to look after her mum, who was dying of cancer in the Japanese hospital, but she emerged as the sort of democratic leader. She was imprisoned, you know, on and off until about 2010. So Burma was slammed in the deep freeze for, you know, 20, 30 years. And then Cyclone Nargis happened, and the generals and half of the Irrawaddy Delta, you know, completely destroyed, way over 150,000 people killed in a weekend. And the international community got together and said to the generals, we will help you rebuild, but you've got to open up the economy, you've got to open up politically, there's got to be much more liberalization. And then what happened is Aung San Suu Kyi's party, the National League for Democracy, was then said, okay, we'll stand in by-elections and test the water. And there were 44 by-elections in 2012. They held the elections first of all in 2010, and the NLD boycotted. And in 2012, there were these by-elections, and the NLD won 43 out of 44. So that was a signal that the military were prepared to have free elections, free and fair elections. And then in 2015 was the next national election. She won a landslide. And then 5 years later, in 2020, she won an even bigger landslide, to the point where she and the party would have been able to change the constitution, which might have broken the military's domination over the whole political system. And on the morning, on the 1st of February 2021, the election had been in the November 2020, the following year in the February, when NLD were about to come to Parliament in Naypyidaw, the capital, the now capital, the administrative capital, and form a government. They were all arrested, and then 3 years of national brutality, state-run terrorism, frankly. The UN rapporteur described it as a campaign of terrorism against its own people. And now what we've had in the last few months, I think, is the battle lines are tilting, and I think the military have realized that they simply cannot win. They're dropping bombs, they're doing, you know, air attacks because they're losing the ground offensive.
And you've covered this story, or it's been close to your heart, as I say, for 30 years or whenever 1988 was. I want to go to another story that's close to your heart, which is the one that we're all hearing about now, which is Gaza, where you worked in a very senior United Nations position in Gaza during a previous conflict there with Israel. And you broke down in tears on television while saying it. What was going on?
So this was in 2014 in the war. There was a much, you know, nothing like the brutality and the scale of destruction we're seeing now. And the Israelis had attacked one of our schools. I worked by this stage for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, alias UNRWA. And the Israelis attacked a school, and they killed about 12 children, their families, and it was carnage. And my colleagues had gone in, as happens, with mobile phones and had recorded decapitated babies. And, you know, you've no idea how sanitized our news actually is. Even, you know, Al Jazeera in English is sanitized. Al Jazeera in Arabic, much, much less so. And Al Jazeera in Arabic came round to interview me in my office in Jerusalem. And they came with what's called a truck. There was a satellite dish beaming it live back to Doha, who were then broadcasting it. And underneath the camera, there was a feed of there was a setup report before me. And they showed the most appalling pictures, which I can't absorb, that kind of brutality, particularly when it involves children. I find that very tough. So I had to sit through like an 8-minute report before I went live. And as we went live, I just thought, I can't get through this. I mean, I was choking. It was so painful to watch this. And I sort of managed to kind of steel myself and got through the interview. And at the end, the presenter said, thank you very much, goodbye. And I said, thank you very much. And as I said it, I felt my voice crack. But as far as I was aware, the interview was over. And so I just put my head on my desk, as I did quite often after interviews, and just sobbed uncontrollably because the subject matter was just so intolerably painful and brutal. But in fact, instead of the camera just turning off, without even telling me, the cameraman just carried on filming. So I just sobbed and sobbed and sobbed for literally, I don't know how long, it must have been a minute. And then without telling me, the cameraman then sent those pictures back to Doha, where in Qatar, where Al Jazeera is headquartered. And they then started putting it out on the top of the hour, every hour. And I had no idea. I was in my office doing other interviews, talking to journalists, being a spokesman, blah, blah, blah. And then it was only when I started I got these emails saying, what on earth happened? And I sort of said, I don't know what you're talking about. And then eventually someone sent me the video of this thing. And I genuinely didn't think it would be recorded. I had no idea it had been recorded. And Al Jazeera certainly never asked my permission to broadcast it. But, in the end, I sort of said, if my tears focus the pity and the sympathy of the world on this appalling brutality that was happening on industrial scale, then I didn't mind. I mean, I didn't want to be the story. I didn't want to be the central story. But if me bursting into tears live, as it were, on Al Jazeera was going to focus the attention of the world on this appalling suffering, then, so be it.
So I think, in today's story, which we're not going to get into, but the Prince of Wales, Prince William, has just called for a complete ceasefire in Gaza. So there is a move to end it now. But I'd like to go back to take that scene that we've just had there. And Denise's question, how do you manage your own mental health with the situations you have encountered?
Can I tell you, Denise, a really interesting story? So we haven't quite got there in this interview yet, but I then, after the coup in Myanmar on the 1st of February 2021, I decided to start a thing called the Myanmar Accountability Project. And you do a mapping, when you start an NGO, you do a mapping exercise, you work out what everyone's doing, and then you try and find a unique thing that nobody is doing. And there didn't exist an organization that was doing criminal prosecutions against war criminals from Myanmar. So I went out, I got funding for it, and I started it. I work pro bono, I hasten to add. And one of our first clients was a man who'd been tortured, really badly tortured. And one day I said to him, how is it you stay so calm? You're talking about the appalling things that were done to you. And he does it with this great serenity and solemnity and dignity and poise and repose and extraordinary sense of perspective. And he said, well, I learned to meditate. And there's a Burmese meditation course, which is renowned the world over, and where you do a 10-day course, and it's a silent meditation retreat. And he said, I did it years and years and years ago, and I meditate every day. And he said, even when I was being tortured, I meditated. And that just blew my mind. The idea that somebody, I won't even talk about the things they were doing to him, but the idea that a man was being viciously beaten and tortured, both mentally and physically, and yet he was just meditating. That blew me away. And I went away and I did this silent meditation retreat in England. It's about an hour and a half from London. And that for me was a life changer, because they teach you how to meditate. And for a start, to be silent for 10 days takes you to places in your head you never thought existed. Some of them terrifying, some of them not.
I mean, that is absolutely fascinating. So if we could just go a little bit back from there, then I want to go on from there, actually. Is that when you were in Gaza seeing these dreadful things, you've told us a little bit that immediate reaction, and your work in Myanmar, other places like that, how do you find that sort of, okay, this is what's happening to people I don't really know, they're not my family, but I'm amongst them. How does that impact you long term personally?
Well, I mean, it enormously is the truth. But what I've tried to do, and this I haven't done it very well, I hasten to add, is to try and channel a lot of my anger, a lot of my angst, a lot of my unresolved rage about the injustices that I've witnessed in my life into sort of positive advocacy, if you like. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about how to be creative about the stuff that has happened. You know, and I've done that through humanitarian projects. I mean, actually, just yesterday, a man who I worked with on one of these projects, I had this project called the Vision Project, where there's an amazing inventor in the States who created an app. You download it onto your app, and if you're a blind or visually impaired person, it will read whatever is on your computer screen. So we got all of UNRWA's textbooks. UNRWA taught grades 1 to 9, so kids from 7 to about 16, I think it was, or less than that perhaps, in Gaza. And so we got all of UNRWA's textbooks onto devices, which allowed them to be read by visually impaired children. So suddenly children in Gaza who weren't able to have an education because they couldn't see or had to have special, suddenly they had access to the entire curriculum. And by the way, they had access to the entire World Wide Web. So suddenly their lives, you know, there you are, a blind person in Gaza with a very sort of narrow view of humanity, and suddenly this whole universe. Anyway, I worked with someone who did that, who I worked with on that project.
So one of the channels, one of the processes is a project. I mean, you've started this incredibly unique Myanmar project now to track down the war criminals from Myanmar, and then the meditation as such. When you come out of your meditation, or when you've done it, how does that change the way you're feeling?
Well, I'm not a perfect meditator by any means. What it is, it's imagine switching off your brain. Just imagine. So you've got all these things happening in your life. You've got, you know, as I say, Tawfiq, by the way, this, I shouldn't really say his surname, but I mean, he wrote to me to say that his eldest son was killed in a 2,000-pound bomb. He was about to graduate as a dentist. Tawfiq has been displaced multiple times. He's now living with his wife, 4 daughters, and surviving son in makeshift shelter in Rafah in the south of Gaza, waiting for this Israeli onslaught to happen, you know, when death will rain down from the skies. That's where he is. You're absorbing all these things, but imagine half hour, 10 minutes, an hour in which all you think about is your breathing, and you force away out of your mind all of these other thoughts. And that's what meditation does for me. So although it doesn't make anything go away, it just brings a time, however long you can meditate for in a day, when your brain simply empties of all of those stressful things. It's like having a rest. It doesn't necessarily change your relationship with the bad things in your life, but it gives you a rest. It gives you a bit more strength and a bit more energy, and knowing that you can have a time in your day, or 2 times, or however many times you like in your day, when you can give your brain a rest and your soul a rest from the angst and the horrors of it all. That's hugely empowering and hugely comforting. And I think people around you will also sense that. And you know, as I said, I'm not a great meditator, but I do it often.
I think I'm going to use that phrase. I'm not a perfect meditator, because I don't quite know how you perfectly meditate. But I just want to put one final question to you. And to our audience, we're going to stop the recording shortly and open up the floor for you to ask questions to Chris. So just put up a yellow hand and anything you want to ask him about what he's seen, about his Stephen Fry comments about Gaza, about Myanmar, Burma, just put it in, and you can do that. The final thing, Chris, is that, and you're a newsman, is that we have all these appalling headlines coming at us 24 hours a day. So 1 minute it's Ukraine, then you have Alexei Navalny getting killed, then you've got an earthquake somewhere, or a domestic abuse, and Gaza and all of the rest of it. How does one handle that if you feel passionate about things? Do you just focus on the one on one thing, like you're focusing on Myanmar and war criminality, or do you think, how do we save the world?
I really do think it's about trying to do things one at a time. I mean, I'm lucky in that I can't multitask. So I'm only capable really of thinking of one thing at a time. And when I start thinking of more than one thing at a time, it all falls to pieces. And, you know, there's the famous Voltaire quote, you know, il faut cultiver nos jardins. It's necessary to cultivate one's own garden. And I think, you know, it's a simple fact that you're no use to anybody if you are in pieces. So, you know, whether you do humanitarian work or journalism like I do, did on the front lines sometimes. I'm not a war junkie. I'm not a kind of Jeremy Bowen type reporter. I think it's really important to focus on what is in front of you and being able to solve the smallest part of whatever you're trying to deal with, and then go on to the next and the next and next, and who knows where you get to in the end. So I think that is really, really important. And the other thing I think, and it partly relates to the vision project I was talking about in Gaza, that when I used to go to Gaza, I would go and see children whose lives had been transformed by this project. So however unremitting the grimness of it all was, it was possible to find some, not even a glimmer, a roaring glow of hope and human dignity in the most sort of innocent and wonderful places. And I think that's something which is possible, however, wherever one's life is and wherever one is, there are positive things that one can find and which are incredibly accessible and often much more accessible than we think. And I think, you know, doing one thing at a time, I think finding something that's positive and accessible and visiting it as often as possible. And also, you know, I mean, it's a cliche, but I have a fantastic husband. I have fantastic family. You know, all those sorts of things are incredibly important human relationships and all they bring. But this, you know,
and of course that generosity that Stephen Fry talked about. If you're generous to people, you feel good. We are out of time on the podcast recording. Thank you so much, Chris, for sharing your experiences and outsides. I found them both chilling, but also very uplifting. The Goldster magazine show will shortly be published as a podcast. Just Google Goldster and podcasts, and an array of fascinating conversations will unfold before you. And to find out more about the Goldster magazine and Goldster itself, www.goldster.co.uk. Come back again, Chris, with more adventures, and thank you for such a great show.
It's a real pleasure, Humphrey. Thank you so much for having, you know, goodbye, hello, etc. to all of your guests. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Chris.